Welcome everyone here in our lecture hall here in the Alexander Library and online. Actually, we have 20 participants on the Zoom already. My name is Anil Mundra. I'm the postdoctoral fellow for the study of Jainism here in the Department of Religion here at Rutgers. I'm the first to occupy this post, of course, that was made possible by the generosity and vision of the Alka Siddhartha Dalal Endowment. So Siddharthji is, of course, here with us, and I just want to give you my heartiest thanks and pranam and round of applause for making this possible. Rutgers, I have to say, is, of course, a wonderful place for this position, not only because apparently there are more Jains per capita here than in the state of Gujarat, as I have learned, but also, also because the outstanding departments of religion and philosophy that we have here at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And so that brings me to our speaker today, because for the first campus lecture made possible by this endowment, I really wanted someone who could speak to the various constituencies here. The students in our classes, in our classes on Jainism and Asian religions that are here, as well as scholars, full-time scholars in the departments of religion and the departments of philosophy, as well as our wonderful, large and active Jain community that is so in evidence here. So that is, I have to say, that's a tall order. That's a difficult circle to square, to speak to all of these totally very diverse and different communities, but the person that I thought really could best do that is Professor Jeffery Long. So Jeffery Long is the Carl W. Ziegler Professor of Religion, Philosophy, and Asian Studies at the School of Arts and Humanities at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. He's been studying and teaching Jainism for 3 decades. He's published more than 20 articles and book reviews on Jainism, and authored an introductory textbook, co-edited one on nonviolence in the world's religions, as well as the Buddhism and Jainism volumes in the Springer Encyclopedia of Indian Religions. He's lectured extensively on Jain thought and practice, including the inaugural Virchan Gandhi lecture at the Claremont School of Theology in 2013, and various talks on Jainism and nonviolence at the United Nations, at the Indian Consulate in New York, and at various Jain centers in the United States. So this much by itself would certainly have justified inviting Professor Long to give this first lecture of the Dalal Endowment. And that's, of course, not to mention his extensive body of writing on Hinduism, interreligious studies, religious pluralism, and other topics, and also the various awards that his work has garnered. And I'm not going to run through all of those. But the main reason that I, as a scholar of Jain, a scholar of Jain philosophy in particular, wanted him in particular here at one of the top universities for philosophy in the world, was that his doctoral dissertation titled Plurality and Relativity, Whitehead, Jainism, and the Reconstruction of Religious Pluralism, is one of the only philosophically intensive treatments of Jain thought that has been produced in the United States. It's actually the only one in the history of the University of Chicago until my own dissertation was submitted there last year. And so all of these years after having read his dissertation, I am very glad to finally hear now from Professor Long on relativity within and without, Anekāntavāda in the context of Jain practice and its implications for the philosophy of religion. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Long, and then we'll have time for questions and answers afterwards, and we'll also take questions from the audience, and I'll moderate those. So without further ado, Professor Long.
Thank you, Anil, for your kind invitation. Thank you all for coming and for this wonderful welcome. So good afternoon, namaste, Jai Jinendra, and happy Ram Navami to those who are celebrating today as well. In fact, it's an auspicious occasion on which to be speaking. So thank you so much for having me here. So my topic today, again, is called Relativity Within and Without. I'll explain later what I mean by that. Anekāntavāda in the context of Jain practice and its implications for the philosophy of religion. You might wonder what this big blue diamond is doing here. And it's meant to illustrate the idea that reality is multifaceted, which is, of course, what Anekāntavāda means. So it's meant to illustrate that idea. So let's see. Move the slide. Okay, it's working. So what is my thesis then? In this presentation, I'm going to discuss a set of philosophical concepts from the Jain tradition of India and explore the relevance of these concepts to contemporary issues, mainly in the philosophy of religion, a tiny bit in the philosophy of science as well. I'll first give an overview of Anekāntavāda, the Jain doctrine of the complexity of existence, along with its epistemological and hermeneutical corollaries, that is, nayavāda, the doctrine of perspectives, and syādvāda, the doctrine of conditional predication. I'll examine these doctrines within the context of Jain thought and practice, followed by their implications for the contemporary philosophy of religion, specifically within the realm of religious pluralism, and with regard to current dialogues between religion and science and between religious and secular worldviews in general. More broadly, I'll be making a case for the importance of cross-cultural philosophy, not only for the sake of greater appreciation of diverse cultures, but for the advancement of philosophy as such. Why am I saying that? In many philosophy departments in North America, if non-Western philosophies are taught at all, it is often as a sort of curiosities, right? So, oh, look, people in other parts of the world were saying interesting things too. But not often enough, I think, is there real engagement with non-Western philosophy as philosophy, that the answers, the ideas, the methods proposed in varied traditions are as worthy of consideration as anything that might have grown up in the modern period or in the Western world. First, I want to give a brief overview of the Jain tradition itself, which, judging from the audience today, I think most people are probably pretty familiar with, so I'll go through that fairly quickly. But in case anyone is not, I want them to have a fuller context for understanding and appreciating these doctrines. So what is the Jain darshana, or as we would say in English, Jainism? Jainism is an ancient spiritual path, one of the four what we call today dharma traditions, originating on the Indian subcontinent alongside Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. This terminology of dharma tradition is a little controversial. It's new. There has been a desire among many scholars in the academy, including myself, to find a way of talking about these traditions that is not so bound to geography. So, okay, these are Indian religions. Okay, does that mean only people from India can practice them? Does that mean that they're only relevant to people in India? There are a lot of people in New Jersey who practice all four of these traditions, right? So a way to speak about them that's not so bound by geography and that really emphasizes conceptual similarities across these four. Because we have the term Abrahamic traditions for referring to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That term Abrahamic is not bound so much to a particular geography. It rather has the connotation of a shared history, shared terminologies, shared concepts. Something like that exists for the Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh traditions as well. So hence that terminology. The Jain tradition is also a vibrant and living tradition with a global following of roughly 4 to 5 million people. I think it's closer to 5 million now, maybe even surpassing 5 million. Jains are best known for their profound commitment to nonviolence, which is illustrated by the mupati, the mouth shield worn by many Jain ascetics, as demonstrated here by the late Acharya Mahaprajna. This slide feels different now than it did before 2020, because, of course, now a mupati is a very common thing. We wear it on airplanes, we wear it in crowds, we wear it when we feel a cough coming on. And so I think this is more appreciated now than it was at one time. The Jain tradition, interestingly, has been talking about and affirming and showing care for the existence of tiny microorganisms in the atmosphere for countless centuries, long before the invention of the microscope. And of course, now we're very aware of these creatures. One of the interesting things about the mukati, though, I feel, is that when people wear a mask now in light of the pandemic, it's also, of course, to protect others from disease, but it's also to protect oneself from the microorganisms. Acharya Mahaprajna is, in this picture, protecting the microorganisms from him. The idea that is that one wants to avoid doing even accidental harm to the small living things in our environment. So the mukati is one sign, outward sign of this commitment, as is the peacock feather whisk that's used to gently sweep the ground free of any tiny life forms that may be in one's path while walking, and to sweep any surface on which one may be about to sit. I always point out to my students, the peacock feathers have fallen naturally. They've not been pulled from the peacock. That would not be very nonviolent. But they are then utilized in this way. The central ethical principle of Jainism is ahimsa, which is, if we translate it literally, it's not simply nonviolence. It's the absence of even the desire to harm any living being. In other words, it's nonviolence in thought, word, and action. Thought, word, and deed. In practice, ahimsa is seen by many Jains not simply as a negative ethic of non-harming, but also a positive ethic of love for all beings, a wish to see all living beings live happily. If you don't want harm to come to living beings, logically that means you want them to live and thrive. Sometimes I think it's seen simply as, I'm not going to disturb any living thing, but I'm not really going to care for it. That's really not accurate. The world's oldest known animal hospitals were created by Jains long ago. So there's an active concern for the living beings in the universe. Now, doing all of this, right, pursuing the Jain path to its fullest extent, requires one to take up a rigorously ascetic lifestyle to become a Jain Muni, that is a male Jain ascetic, or Sadhi, female Jain ascetic. Sometimes we import the English terminology from the Catholic Church. We talk about monks and nuns, but we're talking about people who've taken up the ascetic path. And it's easy to misunderstand Jainism as a living faith if we think that all Jains are doing that. But the number of Jains who take up this path is relatively small. There are about 16, I think now it's between 16 and 18,000 Jain ascetics in the world today, much smaller than the total number of Jains, as we saw earlier, which is closer to around 5 million. Most Jains, therefore, aren't ascetics, they're householders, laypersons with jobs, spouses, families, and so on, with a lifestyle that's not dramatically different from that of many Hindu families, particularly Hindus from Gujarati Vaishnava traditions, which are also vegetarian and which also share a commitment to nonviolence. And in fact, intermarriage between communities is not uncommon. Quite a few Hindu Jain couples, all of Gujarati background. The Hindu member of the couple is from a Gujarati Vaishnava tradition. Most lay Jains, though not all, are traditionally drawn to business professions. As a community, Jains have had an enormous influence on Jain religion and culture, far beyond what their numbers might suggest. I sometimes compare the Jain tradition to throwing a stone into a pond. And the stone may be very small compared to the pond, but then it sets off waves that eventually spread through the whole pond. So the fact that so many followers of Indic traditions practice vegetarianism, the fact that ahimsa is an important virtue also for Buddhists, also for many Hindus, many things originate from Jainism, which have now been assimilated across the Indic traditions. So what is the Jain worldview? Now getting more to philosophy, what do Jains believe? According to Jain teaching, the universe is filled with countless souls or jivas. I'm using this Western term soul. Jiva literally means that which is alive, the life force of a living being, what makes a living being, and not a piece of non-living matter. Each jiva or soul possesses infinite awareness, that is perfect perception, infinite knowledge, infinite bliss, and infinite energy. Now, as I ask my students very often, how many people today are feeling infinitely energetic and infinitely knowledgeable, infinitely blissful? Maybe we're very happy, but in infinite, that's hard to comprehend. So why is that? If the jiva is inherently possessed of these four perfections, as they're called, then why don't we feel like that most of the time? The pure nature of the soul is obscured by karma, which in the Jain tradition is a form of subtle matter or energy that's drawn to the soul when the soul is disrupted by something called the kashayas, the passions. So I assume most people have heard of karma, and they think of it in terms of a law of moral causation, that good thoughts, words, and actions bring about good results, harmful thoughts, words, and actions bring about unpleasant results. In the Jain tradition, there's a step further, which is almost a kind of physics of karma, right? What makes karma work? How does it happen? And the explanation is that karma is an actual thing. It's a substance. Why is karma pulled into the soul? Because of something called the kashayas. The soul, the jiva, in its, you could say, ideal state, would be perfect in every respect, but it gets disrupted by these kashayas. There's a list of the kashayas. I won't go into them, but they basically consist of very strong emotional states. They disturb our equanimity. And if you think of the smooth surface of a body of water, these are ripples and waves. And these ripples and waves have almost we could regard as a magnetic effect on karma particles, which then become embedded in the jiva. These karma particles can be likened to seeds that become attracted to and embedded in the soul. And in fact, this term is used in the tradition, bija, right? Seed, or a particle of karma. There are different types of karma, just like there are different types of seeds. Just as different seeds lead to different types of plants growing, different types of karma lead to different effects in the jiva, in the soul. And there are extensive lists and texts that go into great detail about the types of karma, what one does to bring it about, and so on. Depending on the conditions of the jiva, the soul, kind of like the soil for a seed, the karma particle will eventually sprout, creating an experience of either happiness or unhappiness. These experiences evoke the kashayas, right? Something happens and it makes us happy or it makes us unhappy, and that attracts more karma particles, and the whole process repeats. So this cycle has been going on and on throughout infinite time, according to the Jain tradition. The ultimate aim of Jain practice is to put an end to this process, to prevent further karmic seeds from entering the soul. This is through the practice of equanimity, something called samayika, the calming of the passions. And there's a regular Jain meditation called samayika, in which one sits and goes through a variety of contemplative and meditative mental exercises and also physical postures. This is kind of a Jain yoga, and it's intended to bring that sense of equanimity to the jiva. And in that state, karma is not attracted to the jiva. So it's kind of practice for liberation, right? For making the soul be in that state all the time. And then there's also the acceleration of the burning off, the getting rid of the karmic particles that are already there. This is through something called tapasya, ascetic practice. A good example of this is fasting. Of course, we see fasting in almost all the world's religions. And it's practiced a great deal in the Jain tradition as well, along with other tapasya. We've already had occasion to know how difficult it is to observe ahimsa to its perfection. That itself is a form of tapasya, right? The extreme care that a muni or sadhvi takes in moving about, sitting, standing, etc. Once all karmic obstructions have been removed, the full power, wisdom, and bliss of the soul is revealed. One then attains perfect knowledge, kevalagam, and also thereby attains liberation, moksha, that is freedom from the cycle of rebirth, which karma inevitably leads to, right? The fact that the physical body dies doesn't mean that karma is finished. There's still karma. It still needs to be experienced. So rebirth and karma, just as in the other Indic traditions, that they go together as a kind of logical corollary. Beings who achieve this ultimate stage of spiritual evolution are known as jinnas or conquerors. That's where the term Jain comes from. Jaina in Sanskrit is derived from jinna, just like Shaiva and Shiva, or Vaishnava and Vishnu. So a devotee of the jinnas. Jains share with Hindus and Buddhists the belief in a beginningless series of cosmic cycles, The Jain version is quite distinctive in having a fairly detailed account of how in each cycle the cycle starts at the bottom. If you think of this as a clock, the cycle starts around 6 o'clock, and then it progresses clockwise upward. Things get better and better in the cosmos. They reach their apex at 12 o'clock, and then they begin to decline. And about halfway through the period of decline, jinnas begin to appear in our world to help beings escape from the cycle of rebirth. So in each cosmic cycle, in each portion of the cosmos, 24 special jinnas appear. They're known as the Tirthankaras, the ford makers. I don't mean the automobile ford, I mean the crossing across a river. This means the river of karma and rebirth to the further shore of liberation. Each Tirthankara establishes a tirtha, a path across the river of rebirth to the further shore of liberation. In other words, each of these beings reestablishes the Jain teaching and community so beings may follow this path and attain freedom. Connecting this now with known history, the 24th Tirthankara of our current cosmic cycle, Vartamana Gatriputra, or Mahavira, has already appeared, right? So we've already had our 24th Tirthankara. So our cosmos is on the downward decline. Though, as one of the students in Professor Munda's class mentioned that I was in earlier today, we still have many tens of thousands of years to go before the whole thing completely falls apart. So there's no imminent demise of the universe. According to Jain sources, he lived from, we think, about 599 to 527 BCE and was a contemporary of the Buddha. There are highly complex historical debates about this precise dating. And if we connect the two figures together, Buddha and Mahavira, then the complexity increases. We know they both lived sometime in this period from somewhere around the 6th to the 4th centuries BCE. The existence of a few of the other Tirthankaras has been independently confirmed or is strongly suspected to be factually based by historians. These include Mahavira's immediate predecessor, the 23rd Tirthankara, Parshvanath. He's traditionally dated to about 872 to 772 before the Common Era. Very popular object of devotion in the Jain tradition. If you go to Siddhachalam, it's a Jain center here in New Jersey. There's a beautiful black marble Parshvanath that you can see. The 22nd Tirthankara, Naminath, who, according to Jain texts, it was a contemporary of Shri Krishna and the events of the Mahabharata. And then we go back to the first Tirthankara, Rishabha or Adinath, the Tirthankara who is responsible for first initiating the tradition. This is highly speculative. I'm not asserting it as a fact, but there are some pieces of evidence that would connect him with the Shaiva tradition of Hinduism and also with the Indus Valley civilization, the oldest known civilization in India, one of the oldest in the world. Our main sources of knowledge about Mahavira and the other Tirthankaras are the Agamas, the sacred scriptures of the Shvetambara Jain tradition. This is written in Ardhamagati Prakrit, not in Sanskrit, but a related language of ancient India. This was spoken in what is now the region of Bihar, the homeland of the Maurya dynasty. So now that was background of the Jain tradition. Now I want to come to the doctrines that are really my core interest today. What I call the Jain doctrines of relativity. I want to say a little bit about this term relativity first. My use of this term, some scholars have loved it and said, great, let's call them that. Others have said, I'm not sure about relativity. I just want to explain why I use the term. One doesn't have to use the term, but I was thinking about Einstein. And what I was trying to capture from Einstein was the sense that there is relativity, but there is relativity to some objective reality. In other words, there's a philosophical position, so popularly goes by the name relativism, which is often associated with a kind of agnosticism about reality. Well, you have your point of view, I have my point of view. Who really knows? Maybe no one really knows. It's really a kind of skepticism. That's not what we're finding here in the Jain tradition. But if you think about Einstein and how he talks about the ways in which time, mass, and velocity are all related to one another. It's beautifully illustrated in the film Interstellar, if any of you have ever seen that. We have an astronaut who goes into space, comes back. during a period which for him is relatively brief, and finds his young daughter as an elderly woman because they've experienced time differently. This is obviously not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of the way these things are actually related. And so this is what I was trying to capture with the idea of relativity. And hopefully that will make more sense as I proceed. I'm referring to a cluster of 3 doctrines that are interrelated. We find these developed by Jain thinkers over the course of the last 2,000 plus years. What I'm going to be saying takes the form of a generalization. Each Jain thinker has their own particular take on these doctrines and their own particular contribution and understanding. I sort of abstracted from that to talk about these in a more general way. So one distinctive Jain contribution to world philosophy is in its concept of the relativity, in this kind of Einsteinian sense, of verbal truth claims in relation to absolute truth. The Jains developed in the centuries following Mahavira a complex system of logic that has enabled them to affirm the idea that there is truth in many diverse worldviews. Every belief system, whether we call it religious or not religious, has to in some way reckon with the fact that there are other belief systems. Why doesn't everyone see that I'm right? I'm smart, I understand things. Why do people disagree with me about sometimes maybe very fundamental things? So we have to understand that. And there are a number of possible approaches. One is the skepticism, the extreme agnosticism I just mentioned. Well, maybe none of us really knows it. Right? Another possibility is to say, well, I'm right and they're all wrong. And that's too bad. This is sometimes called exclusivism. There is a little more subtle position called inclusivism, where we believe our worldview. If we didn't, we'd have to get another one. Right? We believe what we believe, but we're willing to grant that other worldviews can overlap with ours and can know things that we know, and maybe sometimes they can even know things that we don't know, and we would do well to pay attention to them, have dialogue with them. And then you have a sort of full-blown version of this, which is called pluralism. We've got many true worldviews, many different perspectives on one reality, and they're all more or less the same. So the Jains took an approach of openness to there being truth in other traditions. This is rooted in the idea of the ultimate complexity of existence, which is the core teaching of Anekāntavāda. That is a metaphysical or ontological claim, a view about the nature of reality. Closely related to it is nayavāda, that is the doctrine of perspectives. This is an epistemological claim, a claim about knowledge. Namely, that each aspect of reality corresponds to a perspective from which it can be viewed. Right, so if you remember the big blue diamond that I had projected, someone is standing here in relation to it, someone else is standing over here in relation to it. They're each seeing a different facet of the diamond. And so their perspective is connected to a facet of that reality. Then finally, we come to syādvāda. This is a doctrine about how to speak on the basis of Anekāntavāda and nayavāda. Claims are true, not simply flatly and absolutely, but in some sense, in a certain respect, or from a certain perspective, from a certain point of view. If I'm looking at my one facet of the diamond, and I make a judgment about the whole diamond based on that one facet, well, I might be right about that one facet, but I might be wrong about the others that I'm not perceiving. So this is syādvāda, saying I'm kind of right, but maybe you're also kind of right. Where did this come from? How did this start? I think there are, like most interesting things in the world, it has multiple causes. One of these is based on what we have of Mahavira's teaching in the written scriptures. We see that Mahavira takes a both-and approach to difficult philosophical questions. So there was a set of questions that were called the avyakta questions in ancient India. That literally means unanswerable, right? Questions for which there's no conceivable answer. These are the big, difficult questions. Does the world have a beginning? Does it have a purpose? Does it have an end? Etc. And philosopher B.K. Maltival, through whom I first became introduced to these doctrines, contrasts the Jain approach with the Buddhist approach to the same set of questions. The Buddha tended to hear these questions and just say no to every possibility, or to be silent in response. And the basic idea here, which Buddhists took from that, was that truth cannot be perfectly captured in any dogmatic way. So best not to become attached to views. And as we've seen in our world today, it's very polarized. Attachment to views causes all kinds of problems. Mahavir takes, you could say, instead of a negative approach, a positive approach. Says, yeah, this is correct in this view, and this is also correct in this other view. So, quoting from a translation of one of the Jain agamas, the Venerable Mahavira told the Bhikkhu Jamali thus: the world is Jamali eternal. It did not cease to exist at any time. It was, it is, and it will be. It is constant, permanent, eternal, imperishable, indestructible, and always existent. And so he's been asked, is the world eternal or non-eternal? He says here very clearly, it's eternal. And this is the Jain view. There's always been a world and there will always be a world. Then immediately he says, the world is Jamali non-eternal, for it becomes progressive in its time cycle. That's the Utsarpani, the progressive half of the cycle that I showed you a moment ago. After being regressive, that's the Abhisarpani, the regressive time cycle. And it becomes regressive after being progressive. It keeps changing. So in other words, if by the word world, you mean this particular set of circumstances that is occurring right now, well, that's impermanent. It comes, it goes. If by world you mean the very possibility of anything, well, that has always been. So what Mahavir is doing is basically saying it depends on how you define your words. This is one of the first things we learn in philosophy university. Define your terms, right? We've all been told that at some point in our training. The soul is Jamali eternal, for it did not cease to exist at any time. The soul is Jamali non-eternal, for it becomes animal after being a hellish creature, becomes a man after becoming an animal, becomes a god after being a man. So in other words, if by living being, right, this actually works better in the original language. If jiva means that which persists through all of our lifetimes, well, that is eternal. But if jiva means literally living thing, the organism that is in this body right here, well, that was born and that will pass away. So it depends on how we define our terms. Another basis for Anekāntavāda is what I call Jain ontological realism and pluralism. Here I mean pluralism in a different sense. So this isn't referring to worldviews, but to the fact that the world is made up of many types of entities. It's not just one thing. And we were having Professor Brian, Professor Lundu, and I were having a great conversation about this over lunch today. There are worldviews, we see this in Indian philosophy and in other philosophies as well, where all of existence is reduced essentially to one fact. So there are what we call idealisms, that they say consciousness is all that exists, there's really no material world, right? It's just an appearance in consciousness. And then of course you also have materialism, which says that consciousness is this kind of weird epiphenomenon that happens because of neurochemical events in the brain. And what's really there is matter. The Jain tradition is persistently resistant to the attempt to explain all of reality in terms of this one. Reality is complex, it says. One of the definitions of existence, sat, in the Jain scriptures is Udpada Vyaya Pravya Sat. This is a quote from the Tattvartha Sutra. It's the one Jain text that all the different groups within the Jain tradition agree upon. Right? So this is a settled Jain doctrine. Existence is linked to origination, cessation, and persistence. That is, it comes into being, it passes away, and there's a period in between where it exists for a while. There's no attempt to say all things are simply constantly emerging and constantly perishing, kind of like a Buddhist worldview. Or no attempt to say change is an illusion and everything is just one unchanging substance, kind of like Advaita Vedanta. This is resisted in the Jain tradition. Jain philosophy teaches that reality consists of a variety of substances, dravyas, that are irreducible to one another or to any further principle. So you have jiva, which we've already discussed, the soul, the life force, pudgala, non-living matter, dharma, which in this context means the principle of motion, adharma, principle of inertia. For those of you who are familiar with Sankhya and yoga philosophy, these are kind of like rajas and tamas in that philosophy. Akasha, that is space, and kala, time. Peter Basarowitz, excellent scholar of ancient India, has also suggested that the Jain ascetic emphasis on differentiating living from non-living entities might have played a role in developing the Jain view of reality as, in his words, multiplex, right? If you are attempting to be very careful and not harm living beings, then it's important to know, okay, is it safe for me to sit on this particular surface? Will I be harming anything? Is this alive? Is this not alive? So his speculation is that based on very, very early texts that engage in this conversation, he sees a connection between that and then fully developed Anekāntavāda. So as I said before, these three doctrines have developed considerably since the ancient period. Jain authors of the period from roughly the 5th century to the 7th centuries of the Common Era further developed the basic idea of relativity that emerges from the Jain Agamas and the Tattva Sutra. Digambara Jain thinkers such as Kunda, Siddhasena Divakara, and Samantabhadra, and Shvetambara thinkers such as Haribhadra Suri and Yashodhvijaya developed a distinctively Jain approach to the concept of philosophical difference. Again, how do we interpret the fact that other ways of thinking exist? Anekāntavāda develops into an ontological perspective on reality as infinitely and irreducibly complex. Nayavāda develops into a corresponding doctrine of potentially infinite perspectives on reality and a categorization of existing philosophical views on its basis. So, for example, in a text called the Sammatitarka, Siddhasena Divakara, a great Digambara thinker, differentiates worldviews in terms of whether they fall into what he calls the Dravyastika Naya and the Paryayastika Naya. That is, views that emphasize substance, that is, endurance, continuity, permanence, and worldviews that emphasize change and impermanence, right? What we call process philosophies. So he uses the idea of Nayas to say, okay, this is why different schools of thought hold the view they do. They're looking at this aspect of it. And in this perspective, Jainism becomes something like the panoramic view that encompasses the various other perspectives. Syādvāda emerges as a methodology that serves to differentiate the truth values of claims into 7 distinct possibilities. And people might say, why 7? Well, you're about to find out. So there are 7 possible values that truth values that a claim might have, 7 levels of truth. This is called the 7-limbed perspective, So a claim is in one sense true. In another sense, though, it is false. If we take both of these together, we can say it's both true and false. In yet another sense, it is indescribable. It is indeterminate. There are many ways of interpreting this indescribable. If you're familiar with Buddhist thought, there's the idea of something that is neither true nor false. That seems to fit into this category, logically speaking. And then you have 3 possible non-redundant combinations of these 4. True and indescribable, false and indescribable, and true, false, and indescribable. If you try to add any more, you just become redundant, right? So that's why it is 7 and 7. So these are the 7 levels of truth. So that's very abstract. What do we mean by that? Let's take a very simple thing. And there are a couple of them right here. A pen, right? So here we have a pen. This pen exists in as much as it embodies certain characteristics that assert. Right? If I say the pen exists, and I don't specify further, I could be interpreted as making a very absolute claim. This pen exists. Does that mean it exists for all time? Has it always been and will it always be? Probably not. I expect it was manufactured in a pen. Will it always exist? Well, my experience with pens suggests that it will either be broken or lost at some point. Does it exist everywhere? No, it's right here. Right? It's in this place. So a pen exists, very simple, generic sounding statement, but we have to qualify it in several ways in order to truly be accurate and specific. If we exclude everything else, we have to say the pen does not exist. It's not everywhere. It didn't always exist. It won't always exist. Its existence is limited. It's conditioned, right? If we combine these, we can say it both does and does not exist. And from another perspective, a pen's existence is literally indescribable. This pen exists in relation to everything else that exists and that has ever existed. To try to delineate those and define them would take literally forever. So I'm not going to try to do it. This is analogous to, I think it's very close to the Buddhist concept of shunyata, or interdependence, right? Usually translated as emptiness. The late Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh used to pick up a piece of paper, and he would say, let's describe this piece of paper. Where did it come from? Well, it came from a paper mill, right? If you're fans of The Office, maybe it came from Dunder Mifflin and his friends. My students always like that because we're in the college in Pennsylvania. Where did it come from before that? Well, it was wood, right? It was wood pulp from a tree. Where did the tree come from? Well, a seed. Where did that seed come from? Well, another tree. Well, where did that tree come from? Another seed. Well, okay, then we have to do that for a really, really long time. Eventually, you come back to the origin of life on Earth, and the origin of the Earth, and the origin of the solar system, and then finally of the universe, to describe a piece of paper. Right? So everything in that sense is literally indescribable. You would have to describe it forever to give a full account of something as simple as right? It is indescribable. And we have our other three non-redundant combinations of these four. So I titled this presentation Relativity Within and Without, and I'm posing it as a question here. Now, I'm going to show you what I mean in just a moment. As I've just explained, syādvāda serves essentially to disambiguate philosophical terms, right? Well, what do you mean by pen? What do you mean by exist? What do you mean by soul? What do you mean by will? And once we specify those things, we can say, okay, yes, this is true of this in this particular sense, and then not in these other senses, right? It excludes those other senses. And then we get the various others growing out of that. So it's a way to make our claims clear and specific. So if we're a Jain philosopher and we are, say, critiquing the perspective of another school of thought, an avenue that is open to us is to say that, okay, this school of thought has made a claim. Say in the case of Buddhism, all things are impermanent. Okay, all is impermanent. So in what sense is that true? And we'll see senses in which it is true. But then we'll also see senses in which it's false. In order to be true, it has to be disambiguated. It has to be clear what we're referring to. The reason I ask this question within and without is, can it be applied to Jainism itself? In other words, is this a self-reflexive kind of perspective? And there's actually some debate about this within the tradition. Different Jain thinkers seem to take this question in different directions. So we will see that it does apply outside the tradition, right? That it's a way of categorizing other views as partially true, but also partially false. And then there's some difference among the various thinkers throughout the last 2,000 years over to what extent that should also be applied to Jainism. So in Samaditarka, Siddhasena Divakara, whom I quoted earlier, asserts that claims can potentially be disambiguated to infinity. Right? You can keep further specifying what you mean, and you can keep applying the sevenfold model again and again. If this is the case, then this is quite similar, distinct, but similar to the Buddhist concepts of shunyata that I mentioned earlier. Right? It basically takes apart verbal claims. It says, well, you have to be very, very specific what you mean in order for them to be true. In texts such as his Samaisara, Kunda Kunda goes so far as to imply that even Jain teaching exists only in the realm of what he calls relative truth, the vyavahara, the ordinary, the conventional perspective, and that the realm of absolute truth, the perspective of a jana, an enlightened being, is beyond words and concepts, nisjanaya. This is very consistent with the Digambara tradition of Jainism, of which Kunda Kunda is part. In the Shvetambara tradition, after Mahavira attains Kevala, he's depicted in the Agamas as teaching and traveling to different cities and so on, proclaiming the Jain faith. In the Digambara tradition, it's said that once he attained Kevala, he held perfectly still. And his body spontaneously emitted a sound, the Divyatani, which was then interpreted by his followers in words and concepts. And so what difference does this make, right? The way we interpret this. If we're interested, and this is what I'm getting to in a moment, if we're interested in using concepts like Anekāntavāda to try to talk about difference, we have to ask the question, is what is our, you could say, limit concept when it comes to how much we're willing to accommodate, how much we're willing to be open to in the views of another tradition. And do we turn that lens back on ourselves, right? So I take this as an open question. It's one that I'm still exploring in my work and in my research on Jain traditions. On the whole, Jain thinkers have tended to use Jainism as the standard by which truth is to be known, right? To not keep applying it self-reflexively, but to say, okay, where do we derive the senses from in which we say something is true? Well, from established Jain teaching, right? So that this is the, I would say, the mainstream view within Jainism. I have an example here to try again to make this a little more concrete. I'm very fond of this one. Students tend to like this example. And I presented this to a group of Jain scientists, and they liked it too. So I feel that this is legitimate. These are all very different looking photographs of the same object. Right, this is the Crab Nebula, many hundreds of light years from Earth. A giant cloud of gas and dust and haze, remnants of a star that died. And it's been viewed through different wavelengths of light. Right, so you see a radio picture, infrared picture, a picture through visible light, through ultraviolet, through X-ray, and gamma. And I always like to ask my students the following trick question. I'll ask all of you right now. Which one of these is the correct picture of the crab?
All of them.
All of them, right? Either all of them or none of them, depending on how you want to take it, right? They all are depictions of the same object, only filtered through a different way. None of them captures all of it because you really could not do so. Right? Any non-omniscient being, right, could not perceive all of it. You have to perceive it through a particular wavelength, right? You have to see it using a particular frame of reference. So this is an example of the way reality lends itself to many equally valid interpretations. The example more often used, traditionally used in India, is that of the blind people and the elephant. Right? Traditionally, Jain thinkers have used Anekāntavāda as a methodology for conceptualizing differences across worldviews. And this illustration, which I take it most of you are probably familiar with, it's a pretty famous story. But you have a group of blind people, and they are given the task of describing an elephant. Right? They're blind from birth; they've never seen an elephant, and each of them approaches the elephant from a different position, and they feel it, and then they describe the elephant based on their experience. And of course, the part of the elephant they touch is going to shape the nature of what they describe. The trunk will feel different from a leg. The leg will feel different from the ear will feel different from the tail, and so on. I might add, very patient elephant too. The elephant doesn't mind the blind people doing this. Eventually, they start to fight with one another because they hear each other describing the elephant, saying, no, that's not correct. That's not what I experienced. Right? Eventually, someone tells them, you're all partially correct. Your descriptions capture your experience, but to the extent that they exclude the others, they're only partially true. In the contemporary period, many Jains see Anekāntavāda as an expression of intellectual ahimsa. I deliberately began my presentation with a discussion of ahimsa because many Jains see a connection here. That ahimsa, nonviolence, can be applied to how we interact with each other intellectually as well. That if I say to you, well, you're wrong, there's something violent about that. So the argument goes. Because you might have some very deep sentimental attachment to your particular view. Maybe it's what your grandmother taught you. And we see how defensive people become when their deeply held beliefs are challenged. Sometimes people cannot even bear to hear a view that differs from their own because they're so invested in it. And if this is something your grandmother taught you, then some professor saying something different, well, they're attacking grandma. That's terrible, right? You can't do that. So people become very defensive and very angry. So we do disagree sometimes. We need to do so gently, right, with the ahimsa. It's like, okay, I see your point. Have you also thought about this, right, as a more nonviolent way of communicating? This was the approach of the late Acharya Mahaprajna. His views have shaped my own a lot. I've read a work of his as I was writing my dissertation, to which I'm kind of referred. And he refers to Anekāntavāda as a synthesis of the relative and the absolute perspectives. In other words, It's a way of trying to bring together the fact that we all have many different perceptions, but we're also all perceiving one reality, right? Reality is one, we're perceiving it in different ways. This brings those together. Mahatma Gandhi did a great deal to promote this perspective as well. He was deeply influenced by Jain teaching, especially the teachings of the late Jain teacher Srimad Rajchandra Mehta, sometimes called Gandhi's guru. And Gandhi was very fond of the Jain doctrines of relativity. He said, it's been my experience that I'm always true, I'm always correct from my point of view, and I'm often wrong from the point of view of my honest critics. I know we're both right from our respective points of view, and this knowledge saves me from attributing motives to my opponents or critics. The 7 blind men, he's mentioning the blind men again, gave 7 different descriptions of the elephant. They were all right from their respective points of view, wrong from the point of view of one another, and right and wrong from the point of view of the man, the elephant. I very much like this doctrine of the manyness of reality. It's this doctrine that has taught me to judge a Muslim from his own standpoint and a Christian from his. He says, formerly I used to resent the ignorance of my opponents. Today I can love them because I'm gifted with the eye to see myself as others see me and vice versa. I want to take the whole world in the embrace of my love. My Anekāntavāda is the result of the twin doctrine of Satya and Ahimsa, truth and nonviolence. Can the Jain doctrines of relativity be an aid in seeing the truth in a pluralistic way, appreciating that there are many perspectives on reality, and helping to guide humanity toward a deeper level of understanding, away from the prejudice and violence that all too often accompanies our encounters with views that differ from our own? Scholars of Jainism, notably John Cord, have argued that historically, Jain philosophers have used Anekāntavāda to make strong critiques of the views of others. In other words, this idea of intellectual ahimsa is actually a relatively recent understanding. That doesn't mean it's not correct, but if you expect to see it when you study the classical Indian philosophical writings, you won't always find it. It's not clear that Anekāntavāda necessarily entails an accepting or open approach toward the views of others. In other words, if we're saying that someone else is partially right and partially wrong, we can put the accent on either of those, right? We could say, you're partially right, but you're mostly wrong. We could do that. Or we could say, well, you're a little off, but you're mostly right. It can go either way, right? And we see it go either way in the texts written by various Jain authors. It's also important to note that Anekāntavāda is not the same thing, as I mentioned earlier, as relativism as a popular sense, the view that no definite truth can be known or expressed. It's definitely not that. On the contrary, Jains hold very strong views about ahimsa and its implications, vegetarianism, and increasingly veganism. I have been copied on a number of very heated email threads about whether a Jain should be a vegan or a vegetarian, and the views are very strong. The non-existence of a creator deity. This is an important thing in Jainism. This whole process has simply always been. The idea of one supreme being who sets it all in motion is not present in Jainism. Karma and rebirth is a fundamental ideas, right? So you don't often hear people in the tradition saying, well, karma somewhat exists and somewhat does not exist. In one sense it exists, in one sense it doesn't. More often you hear a pretty strong assertion of that. This is the worldview, right? This is the case. Although historically many Jain thinkers have used Anekāntavāda to show the superiority of Jain perspectives over those of other traditions, which are seen as affirming one-sided Ekanta perspectives, there's no logical necessity dictating that this method can't also be used to affirm areas of agreement with other traditions. I put this in here because I agree with what John Cord has said historically about the tradition. At the same time, I don't think there's anything that stops the modern Jain community or contemporary thinkers from using this really rich resource as a way of promoting a more nonviolent way of interacting with each other. Jain philosophers such as Haribhadra, who wrote his dissertation on, while adhering strongly to Jain principles, have also used Anekāntavāda to show areas of strong agreement between Jain teaching and the teaching of other systems of thought. This is from Christopher Chappell's translation of his Haribhadra's Yoga Drishti Samuchaya. The highest essence of going beyond samsara is called nirvana. The wisdom gained from tapasya, from discipline, is singular in essence, though heard of in different ways. Eternal Shiva, highest Brahman, accomplished soul, suchness. With these words, one refers to it, though the meaning is one in all areas. Yet Haribhadra is not a thorough novelist. He offers strong critiques of practices with which he disagrees. In the same text I just cited, he mentions specific traditions, like tantric traditions, which sometimes involve things like animal sacrifice. He rejects that. Right? He says that's not acceptable. His ontological realism commits him to an understanding of existence as something in which we all participate, and which we're all perceiving in common through the varied conceptual schemes which we're applying to. And I have to say, I heard on speak on this at Rice University at a recent presentation, and it was very beautifully done, and really kind of affirming this central concept. And if we quote from the contemporary philosopher Donald Davidson, from his essay on the very idea of a conceptual scheme, different points of view make sense, but only if there's a common coordinate system on which to apply. This seems to me to be what the Jain tradition on the whole, right, through various thinkers like Haribhadra are really saying. Right? It's not ultimately a question of this perspective is right, that perspective is wrong, but that even when there is disagreement, that disagreement occurs against the background of a shared experience, a common experience, which as ontological realists, Jain philosophers affirm. I subscribe to, I get emails from this website called Quora.com. I don't know if you've heard of it. And every now and then, and this kind of shows you what kind of interests I have, because they always post things related to your interests. So you'll get questions like, who would win in a fight, Sauron or Emperor Palpatine? Right? And then there are these long arguments about which of these fictional characters would defeat the other in a fight. But the background of all of that is this shared body of lore that they all know and have in common, the Star Wars films. So there's, for disagreement even to occur, there has to first be broad agreement. What the Jain tradition is doing, I believe, is directing us to look at that. And look at where we agree. Look at that shared foundation, that shared background. To again cite Davidson, he says, if I were to encounter a philosophical schema that was truly incommensurable, that it was rooted in an utterly foreign, utterly different set of concepts. He says, it's not so much that I would disagree with it, I would fail to even recognize it as a conceptual scheme. Right? There are limits to difference. And the limits of difference are the world, reality, what we're all experiencing. Disagreement by itself is not inherently violent, but to approach those who differ from ours with an attitude of ahimsa involves being open to the ways in which they may be right from our point of view, as well as from. Is Anekāntavāda a form of pluralism? I've used this term already a little bit. Pluralism, as we use the term in the academy, it's an idea developed by Western thinkers like John Hick, though with a lot of inspiration from Indian traditions, especially the teaching of Ramakrishna. This focuses primarily on the idea of many valid paths to salvation, right? So it tends to leave the question of truth implicit or set at its side, right? Philosophers like John Hick don't say there are many true religions. They say, well, by practicing the various religions, you can gain this ultimate transcendence, which is a different claim. Anekāntavāda would appear to be more of a form of inclusivism. It's open to truth in many views, but it maintains in most of its forms that Jain philosophy is to be the standard by which truth is measured. Arguably, in regard to questions of truth, inclusivism is a necessity, so long as one remains committed to a specific worldview that includes the realist thesis that we're all ultimately part of the same reality. In other words, if you have a coherent worldview at all, you're kind of an inclusivist. Right? Even the pluralists are inclusivists because they think some things are true and some things aren't. Right? It's just an inevitability. As my old teacher Paul Griffiths has argued, inclusivism can be open or closed. Right? You might think that all the relevant truth is in your own worldview, and there's truth in others, but it's already in yours, so there's no need to engage them. But there's also open inclusivism. There may be relevant truths in the worldviews of others that aren't already in one's own worldview. I would want to argue that Anekāntavāda is compatible with an open inclusivism. If we can keep endlessly disambiguating, we're going to keep discovering new perspectives and new levels of reality that we have not yet previously understood. Applied to religion, this suggests an openness to truth being present in many religious perspectives without committing one to a self-refuting relativism. Applied to the various conflicts between religious worldviews and science and between religious and secular worldviews, it suggests that one maintain an openness to the presence of truth in many perspectives, even while holding on to one's own understanding of reality and the process. Anekāntavāda's greatest significance, I think, is in regard to what it offers as a philosophical methodology. As Acharya Mahapragya has said, it aims to systematize and synthesize the twin intuitions that one has a grasp on some particular piece of truth, and that others, even those whose views may differ quite a lot from our own, are also grasping a piece of that same larger truth. That their perspective, different though it may be from our own, is a perspective on the same reality that we all inhabit. I'm getting near the end of my presentation. I think one important idea we want to, I don't claim to answer this here, but it's an idea that I'm exploring. If we want to really try to use this in a practical way, we need to persuade people that Anekāntavāda is a good way of approaching philosophy. Does that mean we all have to be Jain? Or could people reach Anekāntavāda from different starting points? Could there be a secular version of this? A Christian version, a Hindu version, an Islamic version, etc. In a polarized world of intense disagreement across religious boundaries, as well as between religious and non-religious philosophies and science, Anekāntavāda can be a valuable tool for affirming that we all inhabit the same reality. That, to paraphrase the Rig Veda, truth is one, though the wise speak of it in various ways. And that is the conclusion of my formal remarks, but I'm open to it. Thank you very much. I'll stay here so I'm still visible to the people on Zoom.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, so we can take questions from the room, we can take questions from online. We don't have any online yet. Anyone in the room?
Did you help me understand why the last three syāds are not redundant, and why they're not contained within the fourth if everything's indescribable? So if it's indescribable, it's false and indescribable and true and indescribable. So what mileage would one get from the last three syāds?
Well, I think that's an excellent question.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, yeah, sure, yeah. So for people on Zoom, the question is, when we look at the Saptabhangina, when we look at the 7 levels of truth, why aren't the last 3 redundant? Because once you've said that something's indescribable, adding anything to that does seem redundant because it's already kind of embedded in the idea of indescribability. Truth and indescribable, what does it really add? It is an excellent question. It is a point of critique that non-Jain philosophers have sometimes leveled. They've said exactly the same thing. Well, true and indescribable is not really adding anything to indescribable. As far as I've been able to tell, the response of most Jain thinkers to that is simply that this is an attempt to be as complete as possible. And there's some understanding that each of these 7 levels might correspond to a specific school of thought. And schools of thought are a synthesis of multiple claims, right? They're systems of propositions. So there might be a school of thought that affirms things which Jains would say are true, as well as things that are seen as indescribable or indeterminate. And there may be another that could be said, okay, what we understand of this seems to be false. And then there are these other indeterminate things. And then you would have something that would be in the mix. So it has to do with the application of the 7 levels of truth, those 7 statements, as nayas, as perspectives. So the last 3 are synthetic, you could say. And they would appear to be redundant when applied to the same claim. But there is this sense that it's possible to take a perspective from which something is authentically true and yet also indescribable.
But you have an example of that.
I think it's very difficult, but I think if you think of certain schools of Buddhism, Buddhist realism, is very close in many respects to aspects of Jainism. So there are dimensions of it that the Jain tradition would accept as true, and then other dimensions that would be indeterminate, right, indescribable, whatever makes it distinct from Jainism, but not obviously false. And then you might have another system like the Mimamsa affirmation of animal sacrifice, for example. That would be seen as false, but it would still have some other aspect that would be indeterminate if you wanted to be complete. And then you might find a more complex system that would contain points of both agreement and disagreement, like Vaishnava systems, for example. So based on what I've been able to tease out of the text I've seen, that seems to be the response to that. But I'm filling in a little bit of that too with some attempt to reconstruct, because it's not always clear, actually. That we reach a very arcane level of philosophical distinction and disputation at that point. And if anyone knows a text that I haven't seen about that and point it my way, I'd be very happy.
We have one question online from Alan Brill. Would Gandhi be a form of Hindu Anekāntavāda?
Well, Gandhi self-identified as Hindu. And at the same time, I would say he was an Anekāntavāda, and he might be, if you wanted to articulate a Hindu Anekāntavāda, he's probably a great starting point, because he explicitly engaged with that idea. As we look at Gandhi's life, we see that he drew from a great many different sources. Jain traditions, Hindu traditions, but also Christianity. He was greatly inspired by the Sermon on the Mount, thinkers who were his contemporaries, like Tolstoy. And so I think he does exhibit this spirit of an open inclusivism and articulated in terms of Anekāntavāda, that through the view of reality as multifaceted, he's able to affirm things from many different sources. So I think that would be a good example. One I also often think of is from the Hindu tradition, Ramakrishna, who teaches that there are many paths to salvation. Now that's a little more like pluralism as we know it among modern philosophers today. But I don't think you could completely delink salvation from truth. Because, for example, you have a definition of salvation, and that would be true or false, or true and false, or indescribable. So that would be, I think, another example. But Gandhi, yes, because he explicitly engages with it. Yes.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the fascinating lecture. I have one question with regards to the history of Jainism, specifically about the 24 jinas, and the fact that since the 24th Mahavira has already arrived, then so many thousands of years from now, the world will sort of disintegrate.
Yes.
In my limited understanding of Jainism, what is the basis of that? Why does Jainism assume that, or how are jinas, are they humans that reach a certain level of enlightenment? And if that is the case, then why can't you have a sort of like a perpetual, why do they assume that there are no humans that will be able to achieve that enlightenment, and therefore the 24th one was the last one?
It's a fantastic question. I'll elaborate a little more on the Jain worldview. The cosmos is vast, according to Jain teaching. And the way that the cycles of time run is not the same in every portion of the universe. So there are other realms than this one where there are Tirthankaras living right now. And in fact, there are Jains who have taught that it's possible to experience those through advanced meditative states, or to be reborn in one of those places at the time there is a Tirthankara. And so to not have to then wait countless eons in order to get moksha again. So it's our section of the world where this is occurring. Same thing's happening in other places, but they're at different points along the time scale. Now, in terms of the deeper question, it's like, why does the Jain tradition assume this model at all, right? I just kind of expanded it, but that deeper question still remains. I think it's not so much an assumption, it's a function of the fact that according to Jain teaching, one who has attained Kevala, one who has attained enlightenment, has perfect knowledge, right? What's called sarvagya, omniscience. And Mahavir is believed to have attained that. And he taught that this was the history of the universe. And so it's a question of faith, really. Is what he's saying true? And if you're an observant Jain, you say, yes, it's true. So I'd say it's less of an assumption as an article of faith or fundamental teaching of the tradition. That's just how it is.
We have another question from the audience. Someone who wants to know your views of vegetarianism. I guess in particular in regard to sadharan vanaspati, plants that contain multiple life forms,
Right.
In a single plant body that grows underground, right? Then it says Jains are not that kind of vegetarians.
Right. No, this is the interesting thing about the Jain tradition is it's not simply vegetarianism. There are even a lot of plants that are not supposed to be eaten, and precisely from that category. Right? That there are plants that are believed to contain a lot of life forms, things that have a lot of seeds, pomegranates, not supposed to be pomegranates. There are a lot of small life forms in even certain plant bodies. So those are not generally eaten. And I'll narrate a little, my personal experience with this. Having studied this quite a lot before actually getting to know very many people in the Jain community, I made the assumption that many of my students often make, which is that, the Jains hardly eat anything. Right? There must be a very sad existence, right? So I went to the Jain temple in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, a number of years ago for an event, and the food was so good. I went back 3 times. And I would just say this for anyone who's listening who may be considering a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet, but you're nervous about what your options are, your possibilities are. There's so many creative things that you can do. So I'd say to them, eat Indian food, because this culture has developed over thousands of years, really inventive ways of cooking plant-based matter with minimal harm to the environment, minimal harm to living things, even at that level. This is a debate people sometimes have about vegetarianism. They say, well, why vegetables? Aren't plants living too? Well, yes, they are. Even the plants that are permissible to eat are still living things. And this is why moksha is so important, because the realm of rebirth is the realm of violence. We're in a realm where living beings, in order to exist, have to consume energy from other living beings. And once one cultivates that level of compassion where one doesn't want to do that, then the only alternative is to become liberated. Someone might say, well, end your own life. Well, then you'll just get reborn, right? Unless you've attained liberation. So that's the ultimate goal. And so liberation is a state of perfect nonviolence. The jinnas, the perfected beings, they're not drawing sustenance from it.
Another question from online. Please say more about, this is from Snehi online. Please say more about the practice of equanimity, samayika, and how do ascetic practices like fasting burn off karmic particles?
Okay, yes. So there's a twofold process described in the Tathagata Sutta of getting liberated. One involves not attracting more karma particles into the jiva. Karma particles are attracted by the kashayas, often translated as the passions. So if you calm the passions, if you practice equanimity, then you're not attracting karma particles. And there's a verse actually from the Bhagavad Gita, which from the Hindu tradition, but it captures this idea very well, being alike in joy and sorrow. And I really love this phrase, alike in joy and sorrow. You still have joy and sorrow, and things are happening to you that are giving you feelings and reactions, but you're not allowing it to disturb your inner equilibrium, right? We've all had experiences that were maybe mildly annoying or mildly pleasant, but we carried on about our day. And then we'll have experiences that really disrupt us. You know, we feel our whole inner world is being turned upside down. A devastating tragedy, or sometimes a really happy event too. We just kind of lose control. It's those sensations that those emotions that tend to attract karma particles. So if you make a habit of regular meditation, there's the practice of samayika. There's also a practice called predication, which is sort of rediscovered in the 20th century by a Jain monk named Acharya Tulsi. And so this predication meditation is very similar to forms of meditation you see in other traditions. The idea is you keep yourself in a state of equanimity while doing the meditation, but the more you make that a habit, you're able to do it even during your regular life. So that's keeping further karma from coming into the jiva. Now, in terms of burning off the karma that's already there, karmas are eventually going to come to fruition. They're going to have some result, either positive or negative. And so positive or negative means they lead to happy experiences or unhappy experiences. And basically the idea is by deliberately taking difficulty upon oneself with a religious attitude, right? With the idea that this is for liberation. Essentially, you have those uncomfortable experiences right now, and you don't have to wait for the karma seed to come to fruition. It comes to fruition right now in this moment through the discomfort that you deliberately take on yourself. That discomfort also helps with samadhi, right? Because you learn to handle that, you learn to live with the discomfort. So you're doing these things, and you know it's difficult, say, to fast for a long time, but you're also maintaining your equanimity as you do it. You're not just thinking about the next meal. That you're keeping that state of calm. So you're as much as possible trying to karma proof your jiva. And then through the tapasya, through the ascetic practices, you're getting rid of that extraneous karma that you want to get rid of more quickly. So that's the basic answer to that question. Yes.
So I was born Jain and I was raised Jain, so I'm pretty impressed and take pride in the philosophy and the teaching of the religion and the so that's, to me it's great, but vis-a-vis the real world, right? Where we are living in a world where practicing Jainism in its true sense of not harming anybody or not doing anything wrong or eating certain things and not eating certain things, all of that is difficult, so to speak, right? And if I can use the term, nice guys finish last, so in that sense, like even like when we are using, let's say some of my best friends are using Jainism, very staunch religious people. But I said, when you are traveling by a car, you want to travel by a car, you want to travel by a plane. You're killing lots of people and lots of, not people, I meant.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, but there are a lot of living beings, right? You clean. So how do you then, that's where I get struggle. I mean, I struggle with myself. And
Sure. And if you think in terms of traditions that are more sort of dualistic in the sense that if you do the right thing, you're saved. If you do the wrong thing, you're damned. Right? That becomes a very, very difficult dilemma. I think it's a little different in the Jain tradition and in fact in the Indic traditions generally, because there is this phenomenon of rebirth. So you may at this stage of your soul's journey find it very difficult or even impossible to live the life of an ascetic. If you have a family, you need to therefore make money for them to survive. Therefore, you need to travel somewhere to work. Therefore, you need to kill all of these beings by going in some conveyance and so on. But there's the idea that there are things you can do now. You can cultivate faith now. You can cultivate right practice now, which will at some future point in this life, or maybe in some future life, put you in a different condition. And the idea is that you would eventually reach the point where it would be not only relatively easy, but intensely desirable to become a muni or a sadhu, right? To become an ascetic. And at that point, you do it. Prior to that point, the soul goes through stages. There's this idea that gunastans, the 14 stages of the evolution of the soul in the Jain tradition. And we're all at a different point along that. And it's good to want to strive for more. That's what I'm hearing in your question. At the same time, I'll share with you an image that was given me by a very wise person that I knew when I was much younger. When I was younger, I was very impatient to move along the spiritual path, move along in my career path, my life, just every way. I wasn't enjoying being a teenager, right? I wanted to, be up talking to people about Jain philosophy, things like that. So I was very frustrated. And this person said to me, a rosebud is not an imperfect rose. It's a perfect rosebud, which will one day blossom and flower into a beautiful rose. So in other words, be patient with yourself. Keep following the process. The time will come. And, yes, we want to avoid harm as much as we can. The more that becomes a reality for you, the more you'll find yourself drawn to practice that will take you away from those activities. Till then you live with it and, pray for the well-being of those entities and try to minimize the harm as much as possible. But there's no expectation in the Jain tradition that everybody is going to become a jinn overnight, or maybe even ever, because you have the idea that there are souls that just don't go on this journey, right? Abhavya souls. So, and so there's no pressure. It all comes from within you. So when you feel that compassion, that desire to do no harm, you'll find ways to limit it that make sense for you now, and that will bear fruit later, according to the tradition. That you'll, there's that phrase, you can't take it with you, but karma, that's the one thing. Yes. You do take it, whether you like it or not.
Okay, well, it's 6 o'clock, and I think that is a perfect place to end this discussion. Of course, those of you that are here can continue the discussion with Professor Long one-on-one afterwards. So I just want to thank you all again for being here. This was such a fantastic turnout. Thank you all for making the trip to campus, and I'm so glad that we were, those of you that came from off of campus, I'm so glad that we were able to show you our campus and our campus community and the kind of intellectual discourse that we have here. So thank you all for coming very much in person. Thank you all who were here online. We had a great audience online also, mostly students and professors. And so thank you all for being here too. And with that, thank you once more to Professor Long.
Thank you all.